They're looking as happy as ever, and so are they. Let's see how their sugar stores are. Oh, man, okay. They're all up there. Not seeing much action on this one. So let's see how they're doing. Uh-oh. Oh. Nobody likes to see this. I think if we lived in an alternate reality where we never experienced winter, beekeeping would be much easier than it is today, because especially for new beekeepers, learning how to overwinter your hives is probably, actually it is one of the hardest skills you can learn as a beekeeper. I've been beekeeping for 5 years, going on my 6th season now, and I've gone through years where I've had all of my hives make it through when I only had a couple hives, but the moment I started expanding my apiary and growing, I've had years where I've lost more than 50% before. So it's taken me 5 years to finally get my methods down right so that I have a good overwintering survival. And if I was to go back knowing what I know now, things would be a lot different. Oh my gosh, the mistakes I've made over the years. So my goal for you today is to walk away from this video knowing how you should approach this winter, what you should and what you shouldn't do, and to help answer some of the questions that you probably have, especially if you're a new beekeeper trying to navigate this whole entire overwintering process. So come on. Okay, this is the question I keep seeing over and over and over again, especially in all of the Facebook groups, and that is, should I continue feeding sugar syrup even through to December? Now, I know in some of the warmer states, some of the warmer climates, this could possibly be possible, because you can't feed sugar syrup if the temperatures do start dropping below 55 degrees. The bees can no longer process that sugar syrup. But if you are living in a climate where it is still around 55 to above 55 degrees, then my answer would still be to not feed sugar water. And the reason for that is when you're feeding that sugar water, there's still water in that syrup. So the bees still have to dehumidify the entire hive and try to dehydrate the syrup once they ingest it and spit it back out into a cell. And that takes time, and also that does take heat as well. That's not something they can really do this time of year. So what ends up happening when you're feeding sugar water all the way up until it starts getting too cold is you have all of these cells that are open inside your hive that have this sugar syrup that is still super moist, and it emits moisture into your hive. So a general rule of thumb to always remember is that it's not cold that kills bees, it's wet cold that kills bees. And the reason I say this is because I have done this. If you guys remember 2 years ago, I did an experiment where I made up nukes in August, and they didn't really have a laying queen until the end of August, early September. A lot of you said this was a stupid idea, and I don't want to say you were right, but you were right. That was definitely a rough winter for me. I did have hives make it through. Those definitely are troopers, but I had a lot of hives collapse as well. And part of that is because I was feeding that sugar syrup all the way through to mid-November, because we were having an Indian summer that year. But the moment the temperature started dropping, the hives really struggled to generate heat. And what I saw when I went into them later in December, once we had some snow, is that a lot of those hives collapsed because of moisture. You could see a like an icy powder on the cluster, and that's what told me they were too moist that they ended up dying. Now, there wasn't any leakage in those hives. It was mostly just all of these open cells, and you could see the cluster on those open cells, so it was creating way too much moisture than they could actually handle. So if you need to feed your bees, I would definitely suggest going a different route. There's a couple different methods. You can use fondant. Fondant works absolutely great for your hives. The bees will demolish it so fast. So just a warning, you're probably going to have to put on fondant every week or every other week because of how much they like it. It's because it's a little bit softer and it's already partially converted for them, so that they are able to completely take it down and use it right away. Now, another option, my favorite option, is to put down some newspaper. I have a whole entire video about this, so I'll put it up here. where you can put sugar on top of it that has just a little bit of moisture and pack it down, and it'll harden up, and they can use that as a candy board instead of cooking it in your oven. That can take all day long, and your girl is trying to be efficient and save as much time as possible, especially since we have almost 200 hives now. That is just not possible for us to cook that many candy boards for all of our hives. So that is my go-to. And another way you can put some sugar on them is to use something called Mountain Camp. So you could just completely skip putting any sort of moisture, any sort of water into that sugar, and you could just pour dry sugar right on top. That is Casey's favorite method because you're killing two birds with one stone. One, you're feeding them sugar, and two, if there's any excess moisture under the lid, then that sugar will just soak it right on up. So both of them work great. Try it out and let me know what you think. The next question I see so much is, how can I insulate my hives without sacrificing ventilation, or even should I insulate my hives? I keep seeing all over my timeline on Facebook, what are your guys' thoughts on insulating? Should I insulate? Is it necessary? Should I spend the money to do it? And in all honesty, it's all personal preference. I do see both sides of the coin when it comes to that. If you were to insulate your hives, you are going to be making a warmer environment in that hive for spring buildup, so they will build up faster. That's why Casey loves the Apame hives, because they already automatically have that insulation in them, so we see that they do build up fast in the springtime. But also something to think about, so believe it or not, the bees do actually need water to survive, but the problem is during the winter time is they're not able to actually get to that water because they're not able to fly to find it. So the only way they can get any is if there is some in the hive for them to collect. And that's why I don't like insulating my hives, because since the inside of the hive is still fairly warm and the outside of the hive is chilly because it's cold outside, it is going to create condensation. But the good thing about this condensation is, since it's on the walls, it's not going to drip on the cluster. But it's a good reservoir for the bees to be able to just kind of mosey on over there and pick up some water for them to keep that cluster going and staying healthy. But as for under the lid, this is where insulation is really important. I like to use insulation foam about a 1-inch thickness underneath the bottom of my lid. And the reason for that is, when your hive is generating that heat rises. There's going to be warm air inside the hive, and there's going to be cold air on top of the hive, especially if you have a telescoping cover, because it's metal and metal attracts cold, and it creates an environment that will start forming condensation under that lid. So that condensation then will start dripping on the cluster, and now you have bees that are wet and they will end up dying because of this. They can't get themselves dry once they are a little bit wet. So I like to use the insulation foam to kind of create that buffer so that that never happens and you never get insulation. But it is also important to think about possibly having some sort of ventilation as well underneath the top cover. Now, I don't have any ventilation in any of my hives. Everybody does it a little bit differently, but if you want to 100% ensure that you're not going to have any sort of moisture dripping on your cluster, you can open up an upper entrance, or you can put a shim, or you can put an inner cover right on top of your hive and make sure there's like a little opening for their upper entrance. So that way, as any of the hot air rises, because the bees do also exhale, and that exhale is going to be warm and moist, so that moist air is going to have to go somewhere. So that upper entrance kind of generates a sort of chimney effect, where they're going to be sucking in air using their wings and vibrating through the bottom entrance, and then they can cycle it back out through the upper entrance, pushing out that moist air. And one other thing that you can do is you can put a quilt box if you don't want to do insulation foam. A lot of people hear of a quilt box first before they hear of any other methods for overwintering their hives, and I've seen many people like using quilt boxes. I've just never used them myself. Insulation foam is fairly easy and doesn't require a whole lot of equipment, so that's just the method that I've always taken. Okay, now you started beekeeping and you are just as antsy as I am, and you want to get in your hives and make sure that they're doing good because you have bee anxiety, and that's what I always get is winter bee anxiety. But should you check your hives in December or during the winter months? Generally, I don't think it's a good idea to be cracking open your hives because of the risk of what you could possibly do to the cluster by doing that. So, the bees, in order to overwinter, they form this tight cluster and they vibrate their bodies to generate heat. During the first part of the winter months, they don't really have to generate a ton of heat. They only have to maintain around a 50 to 55 degree temperature for their brood nest because they're not going to be generating, they're not going to be making any brood. Now, this only really applies to like a northern climate. I'm in Michigan, so that's why I say this. But in some of the southern states or even in a different country, there are locations where the bees may not ever shut down brood production, and that's okay. But for the northern climates, this is when the hive is going to be very vulnerable. And if you are cracking open the lid or knocking on the hive to see if they're there, it's going to kick them up and make them have to start generating more heat because they're like, hey, what's going on? Something's out of whack. They kind of get jostled around and have to figure out how to find a sense of like homeostasis again of their hive. And this can cause them to go through some stores and just cause excess stress that the bees don't need. Now, once you start getting to around mid-January and through the rest of the winter, or like I said, if you're in a more tropical climate area, when they are making brood in the winter, they generally try to keep a temperature around 93 to 97 degrees, and that is their optimal brood making temperature. And if you were to open up their hive, because this is so hot, they would lose so much heat right away, and you could possibly risk chilling the brood. The brood needs it to be warm in order to develop properly. So I know it's hard, but it's best to just let them do their thing and just monitor them from the outside, monitor if there's any excess bee loss, if there's a bunch of dead bees. Dead bees are normal, you will see them because those are the summer bees that are dying. But if you're seeing gobs and gobs of dead bees, then okay, maybe you can just crack the lid a little bit just to see if your hives collapsed already. Okay, so this leads right into question number 4. And what are the signs of a healthy colony in the wintertime? So I kind of already mentioned a little bit of this, and one of them is seeing that there's not a ton of dead bees. There's still dead bees, but there's not a ton of them. And also noticing, what does the outside of the hive look like? On a warmer day, are they going out for cleansing flights? This is completely normal for if the temperatures get to around 55 or warmer, the bees can then start flying because they do need to go to the bathroom. So when they're in their hive and it's too cold, they have to hold it that entire time until it gets a little bit warmer because they don't like going to the bathroom where they're living. I mean, obviously, nobody likes doing that. But so once it gets warmer, they'll fly outside, and this is where you can start also looking to see if you see dark brown, reddish, black streaks on the outside of your hive. This would be what we call nosema. It's caused by a parasite in their gut, and there's not a whole lot you can do for them once they have reached this stage, especially in the winter. Only thing you really can do is just start planning on where you're going to get your bees from in the spring, unfortunately. But it's not something that's as prevalent as it used to before. As long as your hive was healthy going into winter, generally you're not going to see a whole lot of it. But if this is something that you see, now you know what you're looking at. So, on the topic of diseases, that leads me to question number 5. And that is, are there any pests or diseases that you should be aware of during the wintertime? I mean, varroa mites is constantly a problem when it comes to our beehives, unfortunately, ever since the 1990s in America, at least, and recently in Australia. Now it's hit there too. But really, there's not much you can do in terms of treating them. Everything you did leading up to the winter is really going to determine how they do with those pests and those diseases, especially varroa mites. You can treat with an oxalic acid vapor sometime pretty much now in November and December. I would recommend doing it on a warmer day, not a really cold day, just so that it's easier for them to kind of push some of that oxalic acid back out after it's already killed the mites on them. And that is just more so protecting them for the spring though. So everything you did leading up to now determines how they do. Generally, if your hive is still alive after the new year in a northern climate, that is when I say, okay, they've made it past the varroa mite problem. Now the focus is making sure they have enough food for when they start brooding up for the spring season. So on January 1st, you can go out and just do an external hive check. See if you can notice if the hive is alive or dead. That doesn't really hurt them, just to do like a brief little, like maybe put your ear up to the side of the hive and see if you can hear anything, just to see if they're alive. And if they did collapse, that'd be a good time to kind of clean some things up, just because mice also are a problem and they will destroy equipment. Just ask me how I know. I've had mice chew through my entire box and chew through my frames. Yeah, they are just great little creatures. All right, we have 2 more questions. Second to last question is, what should you do if there is an unexpected warm spell or severe cold? Now, this is a problem lately more so than ever before. At least in my area, we've had the polar vortex come and hit us sometime in like January or February, where it gets to like below 20 degrees with the wind chill, sometimes below -50 for wind chill, which is, oh gosh, it's so cold. We usually always have problems starting our car during that time. But if you do have a warm spell, really best thing you can do is just monitor how they're acting on the outside. That will tell you how they're doing in terms of like the health of their hive. And you can also at the beginning of the year start thinking about putting on pollen patties on your hive. Now this is also location dependent. You're going to put them on earlier if you're closer to the equator versus up here in Michigan. I usually put them on mid-January is when I want to start getting them brooding up, but that's also because lately we've been having some early springs. Usually our first flow wouldn't hit until May, but lately our flows have been hitting in April and we've been around like 2 weeks ahead of schedule. So I like to put on pollen patties to kind of help stimulate brood growth and get them growing healthy and get them kind of kicked up a notch with how they start producing brood and how much brood they're producing. Only thing to think about is you want to make sure you do have enough food on your hive. If they are really light and kind of starving and you're just getting them by with some like granulated sugar, some sugar bricks, something like that, then I would limit how much pollen you put on them, just because they will start blowing through storage just to feed all of that brood that they're trying to make. Now, if you have a cold spell, really, same thing. The best you can do is maybe put up a windbreak if you're in an area that has a lot of winds and a lot of blizzarding, just to help keep that heat inside instead of having that wind whip through them and whip through the cracks and suck out some of the heat inside their hive. You can also check the entrances to make sure they're clear of snow or ice or even dead bees. Dead bees can clog up your entrance, so it's good to sometimes go out there maybe once or twice during the winter and grab yourself a little tiny twig and kind of scoop them out so that they have enough room to get out if they need to, especially if you don't have an upper entrance, because they're going to need to be able to get out somehow in order to do those cleansing flights I was talking about. Also, something I forgot to mention, on days that you maybe have like a warm spell, I still would not suggest going through your entire hive. You can pop the lid, take a peek, but I would not suggest going through frames, only because propolis and glue chips very easily once it's cold. You will start breaking apart frames. You can risk losing a queen. I've squished a queen because I was checking her way too early in the year. You can also ruffle up some of the bees so they lose some of the bees and just cause too much stress in the hive that they're not able to recover from that. Like I said, I've lost a couple hives because I got a little antsy and I was doing that. So I would not suggest that. And the very last question that is probably the most important, because I feel like sometimes we don't fully think about this because we just get so tied up with everyday life, and that is, what should you be doing to prepare for spring? This is a time that you want to make out a plan, craft out your goals that you have for next year. Where do you want to be at the end of the bee season next year? That's going to determine the steps you make from the very beginning, because what you do as soon as the spring hits determines pretty much the whole progression of that hive throughout the rest of the year. It's crazy how one thing can affect the whole year. So it's important to think of a plan and kind of draw it out of what you want to see happen. Now, of course, you're going to have to be able to pivot a little bit, because the best laid plan never goes according to plan. There's always some challenges and dips and everything that you try to do. But The spring season, at least in my area, takes off sprinting. So it's good to kind of just have a general outline of what you plan to do. If you're going to put these hives towards making splits and making new hives, or if you're going to put these hives towards maintaining them so you make a really big honey crop. Those are good things that you want to know. Another thing that you want to be looking into now, instead of waiting till last minute, is if there's any equipment that you're going to need to get, if you are going to need to get bees, because both of those things sell out very quickly. We sold out of all of our nukes by March 1st last year, which, thank you so much to you guys. Still blows my mind the amount of support we have gotten from everybody who follows this channel. It makes my heart so happy. But anyways, before I get all mushy gushy, so you want to make sure you put in your pre-orders for bees earlier rather than later. Otherwise, you're probably going to struggle to find bees. You might get bees that are really expensive. You might even get bees from people that you probably didn't want to because you just waited till last minute and they're the only ones that had bees left. So just think of that ahead of time. And then same with equipment. There's usually back orders once it does hit springtime, just because so many people are ordering what they need last minute. So just plan ahead. That's the best plan of action. Then at least you're prepared when everything starts kicking off, and you don't have to try to make up some work by putting together bee boxes and frames while also trying to manage your hives. It just gets to be a whole lot of a jumbled up mess. And the last thing that you can think about to prepare for spring is to honestly even look into taking some classes to kind of brush up your skills and maybe even learn something new for your beekeeping season. One thing that I always complain about to Casey is that I feel like the moment spring hits, I'm a little bit rusty just because I haven't looked in a hive since October. So it's like, wait, what did I learn? Okay, I'm trying not to forget some of the things I learned last year so I don't make the same mistakes. And I know that if I do some of the same mistakes I made last year, we're going to have a bad outcome. So it's good to keep a bee journal to even look back on and kind of help you keep up to date. So congratulations for making it through this entire video. Thank you so much. I do have a word for you though. Drop in the comments and leave the word gobbledygook. Yes, I did say gobbledygook. And I'll send you guys a free cookie. All right, that's it for me. Don't quit and be fit.